Rapiwa Madzena joins us now from the Money Desk. Hi, Rapiwa, and we're here to talk about fraud.
That's right, banking fraud, which continues to be on the rise. Fraudsters taking chances at every corner, but the Office of the Banking Ombudsman doing their job to make sure that consumers are well taken care of. And that's what we're focusing on here. While banks make greater efforts to resolve some customer disputes internally, banking fraud related to current accounts and internet banking remains high on the list of complaints to the Ombud for banking services in South Africa. Reana Steyn, who's the Ombudsman for banking services, says that while operations are normalizing after the peak of the pandemic, fraudsters are still among us. But the Office of the Ombudsman has been hard at work to compensate affected customers. Steyn joins us now for more. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Ms. Steyn. Let's talk about some of those complaints that have been highlighted by consumers. Nedbank and Capitec seemingly coming up tops for those issues. What exactly is the issue within those banks that would warrant the kind of complaints that had you pay out 30 million rand in the reporting period?
Good evening. I think what our report shows is simply the number of complaints per bank. So we literally list the number of complaints we received for each bank. And then we also say in a separate portion of the report that the highest issue amongst all the banks is fraud. So fraud on current accounts is a big issue. And then secondly, also digital banking. In the digital banking space, we see mobile cell phone fraud and phishing comes up quite tops. So that's amongst all the banks. So not necessarily Nedbank or Capitec, it's across the board. So it's the customers who fall victim to fraud. And they turn to us when the banks do not want to reimburse them. And in some instances, we are able to assist. But I think what we need to highlight to customers is if they fall victim to fraud and they give those OTPs to a fraudster, if they pay money over to a scammer, internet banking, making a direct transfer to a person in a scam, the bank cannot just reimburse them. There are some instances where we are able to help, and that's how we managed to get 30.3 million back for consumers. But it doesn't mean that when you fall victim to fraud, we can force the bank to reimburse you. So unfortunately, it's not as easy as that.
Yeah, but you were able to also look at or assess the performance of the banks when it comes to some of the measures that they're putting in place to reduce the level of fraud in the areas that you've just mentioned to us. What was their performance like in the 2022 year, according to the report?
So what we can measure is, of course, what we see how they deal with complaints. So as we're not being the regulator, we only deal with the complaint side of matters. And there we look at how they respond to complainants. So their turnaround times, how they resolve the matters. Are they trying to settle? Do they do ex gratia payments? Do they come to the party? Do they treat customers fairly? So those are the measures that we look at. And then, of course, if we see a trend, if we see that there are anything that is unfair, and a problematic, as a systemic issue, we will highlight it for the bank, and they will, in all instances where we've managed to see something like that, they agree to either change their terms of the contract or a process that turned out to be a problem in one matter, and we saw that this is not right, and then they agree to change that. So it's an ongoing process. As the fraudsters evolve and they have new scams, the banks all the time have to counter it.
Yes, and of course, as you say, fraudsters are evolving and technology is getting greater and easier to use for them. And so there is a component around vulnerable consumers that you also highlight within the report. And some of the components there that would constitute a vulnerable consumer and some of the ways, I suppose, in that instance that they would fall victim to an instance of fraud.
Yes, so, we do highlight that there are certain number of people that we categorize as vulnerable consumers, and mostly because of their age. So there were quite a significant number of customers that reported a complaint to our office, and we just thought that these customers were vulnerable due to age mostly, and sometimes due to financial distress and something that happened in their life, like a divorce, and also retrenchments. So those are items that we look out for, and we then just highlight that matter so that we can alert the bank what the situation for this customer is. But age is an issue, and we see that there are customers between the age of 75 and 85, a significant number of customers complaining to our office, and in most of those it was fraud. And then there are even a number of people over 85 that complain to our office, and most of those, again, they fell victim to fraud. And I think also the fraudsters target the elderly. They target them because they are threatened easily, and they also believe when they have a person on the phone telling them that they are from the bank and they're going to help them and they're going to assist them for somebody to not steal their money. They completely believe it, despite all our warnings, despite the bank's warnings. So we just highlight that, and we then make sure the bank knows what the situation is, so that it's not just a number.
Tell us about cases that were in favor of consumers around cases of fraud that involve a deceased estate or trust within the space. How many cases there did you find there were complaints, and how many of them, if you have that data in front of you, could you tell us were found in favor of the consumer in those cases?
Yeah, so what we highlight in the report is that last year we saw quite a big increase in the complaints relating to estates and trust in our office. It's not exactly sure why there was a sudden increase, but the issue in most of those cases were a delay caused by the bank in finalizing those estates. And maybe, it was our, sort of our PR and marketing when we alerted consumers that we can also deal with those matters. If they are unhappy with the way the bank has been dealing with it, they can report it to us and we can investigate what exactly is happening. So we saw, I think it was about 250 of those complaints. So maybe not thousands, but definitely a lot more than in any previous year. And in half of those cases, we found actually that there was something that the bank did wrong. There was some form of delay or maladministration that we could actually then inform the bank they have to either pay a distress and inconvenience award, or they have to right the wrong, whatever it is that was the problem in that specific case. So a significant increase from the past.
And then finally, Ms. Steyn, to what extent does your office investigate insiders within banking institutions sharing information that could ultimately lead to instances of fraud?
So as we are not the regulators, so we do not have any power to go and investigate banks or their processes. We only deal with complaints on a one-on-one basis. So if we receive any complaint that gives us information about an insider in the bank that is involved, we will of course then immediately raise that at the highest level with the banking institution, and together with them investigate the matter. But in other instances where it is that kind of issue, it is more a case of the police or maybe even the regulators getting involved.
Thank you very much for your time. That is Reana Steyn, who's the Ombudsman for Banking Services in South Africa.